The White House just released this strategy document, National Security Strategy of the United States of America. There's a lot here, and I urge every American to read it. It's about 30 pages. It's directed toward every American, but especially to MAGA folks who may not understand why President Trump is focusing on foreign policy. Just as an example, by killing narco-terrorists on drug boats in Venezuela. Now, this document explains in detail that it's part of national security and that America's foreign policy isn't focused on exerting influence over every part of the world, just those regions that impact America's quote-unquote core national interests. So, for instance, Venezuela. Now, if we're not safe from drug runners and drug traffickers and human traffickers, which Venezuelan president and drug cartel boss Nicolas Maduro is sending up here to kill all of us, there won't be any MAGA or America First. Now, this document explains that Joe Biden and all previous administrations dealt with the drug trade and transnational crime through law enforcement only, through police, after the bad guys had crossed the border, but that wasn't enough to stop the crime. That's why the U.S. military is now deployed. A key focus for the United States will be rooting out adversarial influence in the Western Hemisphere. For example, some Latin American nations like Venezuela have ties with China and Russia. Now, going forward, the United States will discourage such ties. Now, this document explains that the era of mass migration is over. Border security is the top priority, and every nation will be encouraged to mind its own borders instead of trying to send people here to defraud U.S. taxpayers. For example, the Somali fraud scandal in Minnesota, which saw upwards of $1 billion flowing from the taxpayers for a supposed autism center and food for starving children, but instead goes to fund lavish lifestyles for Somali refugees and even goes to fund the terrorist group Al-Shabaab back home in Somalia. Now, one of the pillars of the national security strategy is peace through strength, because without peace, there can be no prosperity. That's Economics 101. Nations that are invaded in wartime suffer devastating economic losses. The GDP crashes, infrastructure is destroyed, trade suffers. There's huge unemployment and shortages of skilled labor. There's also hyperinflation. Capital flees, and poverty takes root, often for decades. For example, that's what Ukraine is looking at right now. And I'm extrapolating a bit, but based on this document, I believe the White House is saying Ukraine is looking at NATO membership as a cure-all for its problems, but NATO doesn't want war with Russia, and NATO might be very different in the next couple of decades, with some NATO nations becoming majority non-European. So it's uncertain whether those nations will take their Article 5 commitments seriously. Now, Article 5 is the collective defense doctrine of NATO. An attack against one is an attack against all. However, Article 5 has been invoked only once. In response to 9/11, in response to the United States sending out the call. So the national security strategy makes it a priority to help Europe course correct, so that European nations don't suffer quote-unquote civilizational erasure and the harmful follow-on effects worldwide. And that's a reference to this.
We want you to become the next lawyers, the architects, the engineers, the astronauts. I want you to become the next prime minister. From here.
This is in the UK.
We will have member of parliament. And if you are in parliament, you will change this country for the good. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
The National Security Strategy document also reveals the White House view that Europe, including Ukraine, must be realistic and establish a position of strategic stability with Russia. Right now, Europe is too antagonistic toward Russia, and that's not the way to peace. The Ukrainians are willing to die to the last man, woman, and child to fight the war, but Why should they die? Europe shares a border with Russia. That's just a fact. Now, Europe has to establish strategic stability with that neighbor, if only to reduce the casualties. And then, in the future, and this is my view, God might change the circumstances or might change people's hearts. Now, some people say there's no hope, but with God, nothing is impossible. Asia. The National Security Strategy reveals the plan for Asia is for the U.S. to win the economic future and to avoid military conflict by building up U.S. military might. Peace through strength. Now, the strategy also calls upon U.S. allies in Asia, namely South Korea and Japan, to step up in defense spending to counter China. And Japan is already answering the call with a dynamic new prime minister who is modern and focused on addressing threats to the homeland and the entire region. Japan is taking a leadership role, and that's good news. Now, the National Security Strategy also reveals how China became such a powerhouse in the first place. It was because of U.S. support. Now, historically, lots of folks don't know that President Nixon back in 1972 wanted to open China, quote unquote, but he opened a can of worms. Anytime the U.S. extends a helping hand, the recipient grows like gangbusters. We know that. So the U.S. has a great track record as a benefactor. But with China, they're communists with a pernicious ideology incompatible with the U.S. values of democracy and free markets. So instead of thanking the U.S., China began spying on the U.S., stealing intellectual property, manipulating its own currency, and of course is now trying to replace the United States as the big dog on the world stage, even in the Western Hemisphere. So the strategy document tells us the U.S. is changing its policies toward China, which used to be given so many handouts as a third world nation, which it isn't anymore. And China must try to prosper without vast trade imbalances against the United States. The Middle East. The U.S. in previous decades focused regional efforts on nation building as a means of deterring hostility, mainly because of energy dependence. But U.S. energy resources are now greatly diversified, and we're now a net exporter of energy. So going forward, we will respect the fact that the Muslims aren't seeking to adopt American values or our way of life. Now, the United States will respect their culture in the Middle East and seek to shift burdens, as the Middle East no longer commands a central place in U.S. foreign policy, especially with Iran being neutralized as a threat. And the U.S. continues to support Israel's security. Africa. Now, the U.S. will shift from the aid paradigm to an investment paradigm because of the vast potential of this continent. Africa will potentially become a key ally in sourcing critical minerals and other natural resources. And the U.S. will stop trying to export liberal values to Africa because doing so encroaches on their homegrown cultures and ways of life. Now, there's a lot more to this national security strategy document. I just want to close on the Monroe Doctrine. President Trump will enforce the Monroe Doctrine, which established U.S. hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. The Trump Corollary, let's go to that. The Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is to ensure stability and good governance in this hemisphere, which the people of those nations have been crying out for. Now, one of the reasons is to prevent and discourage mass migration to the U.S. We want the nations of this hemisphere to cooperate with the U.S. against narco-terrorists, cartels, and other transnational criminal organizations. We want the hemisphere to remain free of hostile foreign incursion and ownership of key assets, and to support critical supply chains and access to key strategic locations. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, leave a like and don't forget to subscribe.